History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Darkside podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Welcome to a new and exhilarating episode of the Political Darkside podcast. My guest today on episode lucky number 13 is Lisa Keogh, an Angus Council election candidate for Alex Salmond's Alba Party, a law graduate, a mother and women's rights campaigner, or as the left might describe her, a litigious birthing person. Miss Keogh, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good. So you had a bit of national attention after coming under investigation by the University of Abertay. Your story appeared in newspapers, and I first noticed you talking about it on GB News, probably in the middle of last year. Can you lay out for everyone the bones of why Abertay University investigated you?
So I was in a law class, obviously, where facts apparently matter. And we were talking about the rights of women and the differences between men and women. And I sort of outlined, women and men do deserve equal rights, but because we're very different, we wouldn't have equal outcomes. I used me being a mechanic as an example for some of it, to which they were talking about trans as well. And I didn't really know anything about trans, to which point they had said to me, well, how would you describe a woman? And it was like one of those moments, where you look yourself up and down. And I was like, well, me, I'm a woman. I've got a vagina. I've given birth. A woman's someone with a vagina who can give birth. So they all took great offence to this. And I genuinely didn't understand why. They're like, oh, you're a typical cis white girl. And I didn't know what that meant. And like, oh, you're a bigot and you're transphobic. And I was like, right, they've obviously not picked up what I've said properly. Because it was on a Teams call at uni, I could type it out. So I typed out my definition of a woman, which made them even worse. And I just didn't understand why. So moving forward, we were talking about men competing in women's sports. And I had put the point across, Fallon Fox is a man. Fallon Fox was a man by all intents and purposes until he decided he wanted to identify as a woman at the age of 32. So Fallon Fox had been through male puberty. He had obviously the body of a man, and he then went into the ring with a woman, an MMA fighter, UFC MMA, and he fractured her skull within 37 seconds. I said, so you can't tell me that Fallon Fox is a woman when he's essentially going in the ring and beating a woman up, fracturing her skull within 37 seconds. That's not like a woman on a woman. So again, I got called various names. We then went into another seminar. We were discussing rape. And they had said, all men are rapists. Men should be locked up after 6 o'clock. They should absolutely not be allowed out after 6 o'clock. And I was like, well, wait a minute, you can't say that. That's totally sexist. And I called the lecturer out because I was like, you can't go around saying things like, you can't put a generalization on a certain category of people and say that it applies to every single person in that category. I said, because at that point, you could essentially say that all Muslims are terrorists. I mean, but you wouldn't say that because that's a racist comment. So why is it okay to say that all men are rapists? Then I got called a rape apologizer. And somebody said to me, are you saying that the difference between men and women is fact? And I was like, absolutely. And then that sums up why I got reported. And obviously, I don't think all Muslims are terrorists. I was using that as an example to contrast. And when I got investigated, that comment wasn't even brought up. So they didn't take offence to me contrasting something. They just took offence to women having vaginas, men and women being different. Oh, and I said men are physically stronger than women. And again, I used my example of me being a mechanic and me being less able than obviously my male colleagues. to say that men were stronger than women. So I thought if I use a real life experience, they'll maybe listen. So yeah, that was the comments I made, and they were the comments that I was reported for and under investigation for 2 months for.
How did the investigation process go? I mean, presumably you were called into people of a higher level than your lecturer and made to explain yourself, I would guess.
Well, so I got an email mid-April, and it just said that you've made offensive remarks in class discussions and you're now under investigation. Pick a date which suits you and we will have like an interview. So I got interviewed by an investigating officer on, I think it was the 23rd, 22nd of April. And I honestly didn't know what I'd said. So I went into the meeting and I said to her, like, what have I been accused of? What have I done? And she's like, oh, you know, we'll talk about that later. We'll tease it out through the interview. I was like, right, okay. So she eventually cut to the chase and she said, did you say that only women have vaginas? And I was like, yeah. She went, can you see why that's offensive? And I was like, well, no, I can't. Can you see why it's offensive? So, you know, I'm not allowed to answer your questions. You're here to answer mine. I was like, right, okay. And then she said, you know, did you say that the differences between men and women are fact? And then the penny started to drop, that these people had taken offence to facts. And I know a lot of people say they're not facts, but women having vaginas is a fact. So I realised at this point that these people had taken offence to these facts. So I had said to her, you know, yeah, I did say these things, but they're not offensive. And I did notice in the investigator, every time the word vagina was mentioned, she was visibly uncomfortable. So I think, it must have been very awkward for her. Whether or not she agreed with me, I don't know. She didn't elaborate. She presumably wasn't allowed to. But so I was in that interview for about 45 minutes. It then went to, they had to go and interview the lecturers, etc. And after that, they had another investigation. I think they actually concluded the investigation the day after my final exam. So while I was sitting my law finals and doing my dissertation, I was under investigation.
Yeah, that can't have made it particularly easy for you to concentrate on on studying and whatnot. Did they suggest to you what, like, the possible outcome of this investigation was, assuming you were found guilty? Which, I mean, you essentially go in and say the same thing that you had already said. So it's like, it's an opinion you've not obviously changed. Therefore, you are guilty, I guess, of what they're accusing you of. But did they suggest what their potential punishment would be for that?
They didn't tell me exactly what would happen. They gave me a sheet with disciplines on it. The worst being expulsion and potentially losing my degree. And the rest were not really applicable because of where I was in the university. My time at university, I was about to leave anyway. So the only viable, which I pointed out, the only viable punishment they could actually give me was to take away the degree.
How did it end up gaining national attention?
Well, you see, I didn't know what to do. I got this email and I genuinely had no idea what I'd done. So I was at university with this girl. She'd actually left in third year law. And I said to her, look, I'm getting accused of something, but I don't know what. I was like, what do I do? Because she'd already done a degree before she'd done her law degree. So she kind of knew the university better than I did. And she had, she'd suggested going to lecturers and asking lecturers to guide me. And I was like, well, I don't think that's going to be viable. A friend of mine actually suggested the Free Speech Union, which I had never heard of before. I emailed the Free Speech Union. I gave them an overview of how the interview had went, because obviously up until the point of the interview, I didn't know what I'd done. So I gave them an overview of how the interview went. Fraser phoned me the very next day and I spoke to him, and obviously the Free Speech Union put it to the press. I didn't have any press contacts or anything like that. So it was the Free Speech Union had obviously gone to the Times had printed it. And then after it had been in the Times, it got an awful lot of attention. I didn't have any social media or anything at this point. I was quite a boring person, probably still am quite a boring person in all fairness. So I didn't want it either, because I thought when it was in the press, I knew there would be negative things. I actually, because of the way the university had treated me and the people at university had treated me, I actually started to think that maybe I had actually said something wrong. So when it went to the paper, I had that kind of fear about me, like, oh my God, like everyone's going to hate me. Everyone's going to think I'm like whatever they're calling me. And it was that real fear that you just didn't know how you were going to be perceived. So when the Free Speech Union said to me, you're actually getting a lot of support, and then the Daily Mail had got in contact, and then before I knew it, it was everywhere. I was on the BBC, I was on GB News, I was kind of everywhere at this point. And I realised, I didn't do anything wrong. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong, but I you start doubting yourself when you've got people, including lecturers, saying that you have.
Yeah, the lecturer thing's quite interesting in as much as since I went to university, it seems it certainly was left leaning, but I suppose the definition of what left is now has moved so far left culturally that when I went, that would have been 2005 to 2009, it wasn't as obvious. Like you could kind of, in debates, you could basically say whatever you liked and it was encouraged and it wasn't shot down, as it were. So it's interesting to hear that universities are no longer a place for open debate, and that's quite dangerous in our society.
Actually, in my time at university, before I did my law degree, I did a couple of years of forensic psychobiology to go into law with. And I did take part in a couple of debate classes, and they were great. I mean, we spoke about things from abortion to euthanasia, religion, immigration, and everyone had different opinions. We'd bring in guest speakers, so we'd bring in like a pastor, we'd bring in like immigrants, we would bring in people who were there to discuss their views, and they wanted to put their view across, and they would take a vote at the start of the lecture to see where you stood, and it went up on the whiteboard. It'd say who voted, well, not who, but it'd give you a percentage of who voted what, and then they would do the same at the end to see if you changed your mind any. And it was really engaging. But that was back in, when did I start uni? 2015. So from 2000, no, it couldn't have been 2015, I'm trying to think. I was at uni for 7 years. Well, when I started forensic psychobiology, the law degree was 4 years. So just before I went into the law degree, basically it was encouraged. And I believe it is encouraged in some classes, but apparently just facts are not allowed in law.
Curious. You mentioned you're on GB News. I watched that interview again recently, and you shared the platform with a trans woman who seemed to was quite a sensible representative of the other side of this argument, basically, saying that generally trans people want to quietly live their lives, and that the cancel culture ultimately makes things worse for them as it draws undue amounts of attention. Generally, that's probably true of most minority group situations. Do you think there's a disproportionate amount of time and attention given to this sort of thing, especially given, for example, there's a war going on, there's an economic crisis, we've gone through a pandemic? Like, it strikes me that identity politics, gender identity and whatnot, it's kind of, not to downplay it, but is it of that greater relevance to that many people in society?
I think that's a yes and a no question. So I think I agree with you on the transsexuals, because there's a difference between transgender and transsexuals, I've come to realise. Transsexuals are people who actually go through the operation and do go on to live life as the opposite sex, so to speak. The people that I know that are transsexual, post-op transsexuals, they don't care about this fight. They kind of want left alone. For me, this is like a social contagion thing. This is like the newest trend. I don't believe all the sort of young people that are saying that they're trans are trans. I personally think a lot of them are going through a phase. Some of them might genuinely be trans, but I think it's very important to have it in the news just now, because we have got laws changing that mean in Scotland, a man can declare himself a woman and can start using women's changing rooms. Can literally, like if I'm in the changing room with my sons, a man can walk in and just strip off and, walk about with his penis hanging out. And that's not right. And I think people need to know that this is going on, because people are voting for political parties that are actively supporting this and actively pushing these laws through. So I think people need to know that essentially it's women's rights are being eradicated because of this. men in general, not all men, but generally it's men are saying that they're women to gain access to women's safe spaces, changing rooms, rape crisis centres, hospital wards, and places where women genuinely just need to be on their own. Personally, I think it's good that it's getting the attention, but I don't think it's being emphasised in the way it should. And I think you're right to an extent. There's so much other stuff going on in the world that it on the spectrum, what they're saying is not quite that important. Because for me, again, I do just think it's a phase that these people are going through. But I think at the same time, it is vitally important that parents, especially, like I just put something on Twitter yesterday. There's a book, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's aimed at children from aged 4 to 8. And essentially it's a sex guide. The little boy's sister has sex in front of him to show him how to have sex. I think he's 4 and she's about 13. Don't quote me on that. She might not be 13. And I think this is actually leaking into our schools. Like, our children are being encouraged to lie to their parents if they don't want to be the gender that they were born. They're allowed to keep secrets from the parents. Children are being asked inappropriate questions. And I think it all stems from, this same place. So I think it's got its place. And I think right now it is quite important. But I do take your point that there is a lot more important things going on in the world. But I do think a lot of this is a sort of grooming children, and parents need to know about this.
There was a weird interview with Joe Biden a couple of weeks back, and it was a headline in The Guardian that caught my attention. And it was after the leak about the Supreme Court ruling on abortion, which we can touch on at some point. But the title of the article was, Joe Biden warns LGBTQ plus children could be next target of Republican MAGA crowd. And the thing about that that's striking is LGBTQ plus children. So again, perhaps I'm massively ignorant on this issue, but surely the age of consent is the most important situation in here. So how can a child know that it's lesbian or gay or bi, given that it's not legally even able to consent to any sexual situations?
I don't agree with trans children at all. I'm quite grateful I grew up when I did. I was a tomboy. I didn't wear dresses. I wore boys' clothes. I had action men. I trained as a mechanic. I think had I grown up now, potentially I would have been one of those trans children. But no, trans children don't exist. And you're right, the age of consent is in this country 16. I suppose when you're younger, you would know if you fancy boys or fancy girls, but
yeah,
there's nothing sexual in it. Certainly there wasn't for me when I was young. I used to have crushes on boys. I knew I liked them. I didn't know what I liked about them. I just kind of knew I had a little soft spot for them. And I think it's kind of the same with children now. Like, I've got 2 sons. One of them just had a girlfriend at school. He used to hold her hand, and that was as far as it went. He didn't even kiss her. I mean, he's 10. He doesn't have sexual feelings right now. He doesn't even know what sex is. He's not even been given sex education at school.
I suppose the sexuality of it probably doesn't kick in until 12, 13 kind of age. I suppose the argument from the other side would probably be that the children, fancying opposite sex other children is socially constructed. And that's probably where it gets quite messy, because that's when you start.
Sorry, 2 seconds. Right, enough, boys, enough. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So it's the argument probably from the left is going to be that it's socially constructed that boys are meant to like girls and vice versa, as opposed to like the situation you found yourself in, essentially talking about biological fact. I mean, it is biological fact that for a baby to be created, you need male and female. It's as simple as. Therefore, it is inherently natural in the human species that boys like girls and girls like boys. It's just, I don't know. It seems to have got out of control as a conversation, especially when children are dragged into it.
Children shouldn't be brought into this at all. Children are innocent, and I think we need to keep our children innocent. They don't need to know about this until the time's right. I don't know when the time's right. My son's about to start sex education next month. He will be just about 11. I feel quite uncomfortable about that, if I'm being honest. But at the end of the day, if I withhold him from the sex education class, his friends are all going to learn about it, and he's going to get secondhand information from 10-year-old boys. So you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place with that. And again, for me, I think teaching children about sex so young, I didn't know anything about sex until I was about 13, 14. Had I went home to my mum or my nan when I was like 7, 8, 9 and started talking about sex, for me, and probably for them, they would have wondered why I was talking about it and where I had learned that. And that would have been a red flag to indicate that I'd possibly been abused. And I think we're normalizing sex in children now, and it muddies the line, it muddies the waters with the whole safeguarding. Like, how can you tell which children are being abused and which ones are not being abused if sex is just normal to them?
Yeah, that's a very good point. You mentioned that you're a member of the Free Speech Union, and obviously I completely agree and believe in your right to say what you had said in your university class. Coincidentally, I obviously do agree, but I'm going to play devil's advocate because I like to play with the ideas. So we're only a few generations removed, in this country at least, from women not having the vote, from laws against homosexuality, etc. I mean, I obviously consider myself to be a young man, but I simply don't understand the new gender language. I essentially don't know what I don't know here. Like you said at the beginning, you had to go Google what a cis woman was. Apparently, I think that's what I fancy. I'm not entirely sure. It's, like you say, it's confusing. So, like I say, I don't know what I don't know, nor if I even need to know it. So have we just not caught up with the change in norms here?
No. No, it's not that at all. I think there's no such thing as cis. If you're born a woman, you're a woman. If you're born a man, you're a man. Again, I think like when I was at school, there was goths and there was moshers and like punks and things like that. I genuinely do think that this gender craze is something like that. The only difference now is, I suppose, like when I was at school, you had like the kids that all like wear all the black eyeliner and stuff, and they'd all go and get like stoned at the weekends. And that was, you know, some people say it was dangerous, some people say it's not. But now we've got surgeons that are taking like scalpels and giving young girls double mastectomies because they want to be boys, and they're fluffing it up and calling them top surgery, but it's not. It's not nice and cuddly top surgery. It's a double mastectomy. It's removing healthy breast tissue from young girls, and I don't think it's the fact that we've not caught up. There's always been gay people, and that's who they're sexually attracted to. I think, really, I mean, I've got a friend, his daughter was 10. She came to him with her best friend, or about her best friend, and said, oh, you know, whatever her name, she's a pansexual, and I don't even know what that is. But I mean, for me, you get straight, you get gay, and you get bisexual. These, I think pansexuals, I might be wrong, but pansexuals where you like all genders. For me, genders, just, I don't even believe in the word gender as sex. You get two sexes, male, female. If you like all genders, you're bisexual, you're not pansexual. I don't think it's a case that we've not caught up. I just think it's people trying to be quirky and different. Quite possibly. That's a good point. I mean, to put it in an international context, two things that I find striking. The Chinese don't tend to teach their children about this sort of thing. They learn maths. So, not that ours don't, but there's certainly more useful things they could be learning, perhaps. And weirdly, one of the countries that has the highest level of trans operations is Iran, because homosexuality is still illegal. But the trans operations are not. Therefore, if a gay couple decides they want to be together, one of them has to go through the transition, which, I mean, that's crazy in and of itself. So, like I say, it's different. It's interesting to look at different cultures, certainly through different times, and it's certainly odd to consider that on this same planet there is that much variety of what is considered culturally and legally acceptable. To be fair, do you know what? If you're over 18 and you want to mutilate your body, that's completely up to you. But I think when we're teaching this to children, like you say, in China, they're teaching them more maths, and I think, why are we not teaching our children maths, history, geography, languages, English? Why are we putting such an emphasis on this gender studies stuff when it's not needed? We're putting ideas into our children's heads, and that's why I use the word grooming. We're grooming them to these new ideas. So by the time our children are in their 20s and 30s and they're having their children, this will be a totally normal concept to their children. And I just worry what the hidden agenda behind all of this is.
Yeah, I spoke to the leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party a few months back, Tam Laird, and he basically outlined how it is like a Marxist agenda, which is like they described it as the long march through institutions, which has been going on for perhaps 50 years, starting roughly in the 60s. So the long-term plan was essentially, okay, well, we're not going to win any of these debates just now and bring forth communism and whatnot. So if we get through the institutions first, we become the teachers, then we then control the language, we control what children learn and whatnot, and then we'll change culture over the space of 100 years if we have to, and then we have won, I guess was their position. So yeah, that's a daunting thought, but with that in mind, it's quite surprising you managed to hold on to your degree. So I guess
the only reason I did was because of the media attention. I think had the media not got a hold of it, things may have ended up very differently for me.
Yeah, so you mentioned you'd also spoken to the BBC. How did that go? I've not actually seen that.
So I was on the 9 show. I would say the 9 were quite hostile. That must have been about a year ago now. I can't actually remember word for word what they said. I just remember it being quite hostile. I was also on Women's Hour, where Emma Barnett had said to me, you know, if you could change things, would you say anything or do anything different? And I was like, no, I would still do the same. But she sort of asked the same question in a roundabout way 3 different times, almost like she was trying to get me to trip up and say, well, you know what, I'm sorry for what I said, when I'm not sorry for what I said. We're over a year on and I'm still not sorry for what I said. Do you know what? Women have vaginas.
That's fair enough, yeah. So what's the current situation with it? I understand are you suing the university currently?
Yeah, I'm suing Abertay just now. We were hoping to be in court in May. The court date had to be moved, so it's looking like it's going to be August, September time, and we'll see where it goes from there. The legal team that I've got represent me are very positive. So yeah, I can't really give updates just now, but as and when I can, I'll post updates on Twitter. I was hoping to get May out of the way, but it was something beyond my control came up, and another case took priority, which was very fair given the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fair enough. You mentioned before essentially saying, you know, once you're over 18, it's up to you what you want to do with your body and whatnot. And that tends to be my position. I mean, nobody's sitting here seriously saying, you know, anybody should be persecuted. Everyone's got the right to live peacefully and comfortably like anybody else. Do what you like, as long as it doesn't encroach on anybody else, is essentially the way it should be. The debate that seems to have grown is when it actively pushes up against women's rights currently. I mean, it seems like we quite often hear from people like Sharon Davies or J.K. Rowling talking about these issues. You've been doing some women's rights campaigning. Can you tell people about what you've been doing?
So I've done a bit of work with Women Scotland, and I'm just, you know, trying to use my experience to emphasise the lack of free speech that we've got. And due to what I said, it does show that women's rights are, I would say, being eradicated, because a lot of these sort of trans people will say, oh, you know, we don't want to encroach on women's rights. We just want we just want like referred by the right pronouns. And, you know, to that, I would say I'm not happy to call you the right pronouns. I think that's compelled speech, if I'm being honest. I couldn't physically call a man a woman. I will use the chosen name you will use, but I think if we are, you know, accepting of you living as a woman, you've got to accept that we want our own spaces. And especially like in prisons, you've got women in prisons, and most women in prisons have been victims of domestic abuse or rape. They've not had the best start. And that's kind of what's led on to them going to prison. When they're in prison, they're locked up. You've then got intact males saying that they're females and then being placed in the women's estate. Now, for the women who have been victims of domestic abuse and worse, that's got to be terrifying. They are locked up with, and a lot of these women will be terrified of men. They're locked up with men and they've got nowhere to go. I mean, I've heard stories about women being raped in prison. There's condoms in prisons in America. There shouldn't be condoms in women's prisons in America because women don't have penises. Women don't need condoms. I know. I mean, I know I'm kind of laughing about it, but it's true. You know, we have a biological man who is, I can't remember his title, but he's a very high up man in the Rape Crisis Centre in Edinburgh. He's a man. He shouldn't be in a women's rape crisis centre. So these people saying they just want to live their life, I'm happy for them to live their life, but do not force yourself on vulnerable women.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I tend to, as a male, obviously, I find it difficult to fully engage in the conversation because obviously I can't empathize not being in those situations. You know, like it's not like I walk down the street at night and, you know, there's a potential for anything to happen to me and whatnot. I mean, it obviously does happen, yeah, but it's not. It's a difficult space for men to speak about it. It tends to be spoken in women's circles amongst other women. So when it is pushed more nationally for men, I think we probably find it more difficult to understand, but we certainly find it easier to understand than the trans debates, I would say.
I think the problem with the trans debate is they don't want to understand. And I say they, I don't even mean they, because like I say, there's a lot of trans people who are genuinely just trying to live their life and they don't want to be part of this. Like certainly the ones I know just weren't left alone. They were living their lives quite happily under the radar. They weren't getting outed or anything like that. And they were just living their life. And now, because we've got this massive debate on, they're getting dragged into something that they otherwise wouldn't have been dragged into. You know, I've got a friend who says, like, I stand with women. I will never be a woman, but I stand with women. And this person went through the op, I think about 30 years ago. And even now, like, will say, I'm not a woman, I'm biologically male, and gets attacked for that.
Yeah, that's curious. I mean, I knew a couple of trans people probably 10, 15 years ago, and it like nobody cared. You know, it wasn't a big deal. But now it seems to have, because it's become like a mainstream national issue, it's almost forcing people to pick sides, which is creating the animosity. And then, like you say, there's dragging children into the debate and everything, and it's just got out of control. But hey, it's what it is. Since I initially wrote these questions, we've seen the American Supreme Court leak showing the potential for alterations to the Roe versus Wade abortion laws. Obviously, you studied law, so you perhaps have a reasonable understanding of this. It's my understanding that it's a defederalization of the law, removing the constitutional protection for the right to have an abortion, leaving it up to individual states to decide. This would mean that in some states, automatically laws will kick in that will make it illegal to have an abortion in those states. Personally, I'm not particularly aggressive one way or another about this issue. There should probably be a clearly defined moment at which the fetus could be considered alive, you know, perhaps heartbeat, feeling pain. There should probably be that time that you maybe shouldn't have an abortion after that. I'm not sure. Again, it's the same as like the rape debate. I can't really put myself in a woman's shoes because I don't consider myself to be a birthing person. So what do you make of the situation?
I understand both sides of the argument. Personally, I agree with abortion. I don't agree with abortion. I think there's a time and a situation and a scenario for abortion. I think the woman should, to a point, have the right to decide in her own body if she wants to carry a child, but there does come a point in that pregnancy where the fetus does turn into a child. I don't agree with late abortions. For me, you can. I know people who've had children very premature, and those children have survived. And I don't personally, and this, I don't speak for all women, of course I don't, because I know there's a massive argument on this, but I don't see why one child at a certain period is a child and one's a fetus. There has got to be a line. I don't know where that line is. I think years and years ago, it was probably a lot harder to access birth control. But now we've got, you've got condoms, you've got the contraceptive pill, you've got the morning after pill. There are precautions that you can take to prevent yourself from getting pregnant. And, I don't know, I wouldn't like to put a number on it. I wouldn't like to put a number of weeks on it, but I certainly wouldn't have it quite as late as what it is. I understand why it is, because obviously you've got abnormality tests to find out if the child's going to be disabled. And in those circumstances, yeah, I do agree that if you're going to have a child that's got life debilitating issues, then abortion is the right way to go. If you've been raped, of course you should get an abortion. If it's incest, of course you should get an abortion. But I think every pregnancy should be taken on a case-by-case basis. I would never judge someone for having an abortion. Everyone's entitled to their own reason. But I do think there should be a limit on abortion. I don't think we should ban abortion. I don't think that should ever happen. I think if we banned abortion, then women would seek alternative ways to abort children, possibly endangering their own lives. But yeah, for me, it is the woman's right to decide, but to a certain point.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the irony of me bringing this an American issue up, and then me now saying it seems like it's another hot button issue that's come from America, which is now going to spread through the UK, which is like George Floyd, Black Lives Matter situation, which went worldwide. It like, there's obviously no change happening in the UK at the minute, so it seems remarkable that we
America, generally what happens in America does.
Yeah, we're highly culturally influenced, not necessarily legally, which is curious to see so many people jumping on it. Purely from a political point of view, I find it remarkably stupid of the Republicans to do this now, given that if you look at Joe Biden's approval ratings, generally the Democratic Party's approval ratings, the inflation, the unpopular war in Ukraine, they could be on for an absolute hiding come November midterms, and all they had to do was just shut up and not do anything stupid. And certainly the Trump MAGA section of the Republican Party were probably going to crush their opposition and win quite a lot of Senate seats and House of Representative seats, which is curious, therefore, that this would actually leak out of the Supreme Court. It does kind of imply the single party state thing, which is you saw was desperate to keep Trump and that element of the Republican Party out of politics. You would see people like George Bush Jr. and Barack Obama hand in hand against the likes of the Trump candidates, which was quite curious, I always thought. So yeah, it does. The timing of this strikes me as remarkable, because if there's one issue that will drag people back to voting Democrat no matter what in America, it is the abortion issue, because it's so divisive over there, down religious lines and my body, my choice lines, which I find remarkably ironic, given that most of those people were the same people who were saying you must be vaccinated, otherwise you're a danger to everybody else around you. So yeah, it's there's a lot of curious ironies going on with that.
To be fair, I see the argument a lot online as well. And I totally agree with this. Women will say men don't have rights to make decisions on women's bodies, and I agree with that as well. I think if people are discussing abortion, it should be women, because no man's ever going to get an abortion. But like I say, I'm not sure what the terms are, pro-life and pro. I don't know.
Choice. It's pro-choice.
Pro-life and pro-choice. I'm somewhere in the middle with that. Like I say, it should never be banned. I don't think men should be making choices on this because it's something that a man will never ever experience. But it's not really an argument I feel I should really get into, because I think people wouldn't agree with me.
Yeah, possibly not. I suppose the devil's advocate of what you've just said there is the baby that is growing inside the woman is as much partly made by the man as it is made by the woman. So the man should have a say in whether there's, I would say that in the situation of where perhaps you're in a perfectly normal relationship and you've got pregnant and say the woman doesn't want to keep it, but the man does, that's a curious situation, I would say. It
is. But again, I think it's the woman that's got to go through with the pregnancy. I've had 2 pregnancies and I had relatively easy ones, but ultimately it's my body, it's my mental health. It's me that's got to carry that child. And if you're pregnant and your partner suddenly decides, which a lot of men do, it's too much for me, I'm not having anything to do with this, you're quite literally left holding a baby that perhaps without a partner, you're not financially able to look after or mentally able to look after. And you've potentially then got a child that's going to be brought up into a home where, you know, a woman's maybe kept it to keep her partner happy. So, like I say, I think every abortion situation should be taken on a case-by-case basis. I think there's an argument for every woman to want an abortion, and I think there's an argument for every woman not to want an abortion. I do take on what you're saying about the man having a say, but like I say, it's generally 9 times out of 10 the woman that's left holding the baby.
Yeah, what you mentioned there about the financial aspect of it's quite curious, because I given even before inflation, given the cost of everything, I have no idea how people afford to have children. Like, I can barely afford dogs, and and we've got 2 incomes in the household and everything. It's also curious when you look around in society. Say you compare now to 50 years ago, like people seem to be having children a lot later than they were doing. Like people were knocking out 3, 4, 5 children by the time they were in the mid-20s, back in like the 40s and 50s and whatnot. I mean, I suppose we probably had a population crisis after the World Wars and the original flu pandemic, but it was more like culturally it was the done thing to have large families and that. And the strange thing now is you mentioned children not necessarily being brought up in the right environment, the right homes, because the dad might have left or whatever. It seems like when you see people with a lot of children, they aren't necessarily the people best placed to be raising the children, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Like it's really low income or low education levels, people living in poor environments and poorer areas of city centres and whatnot. It seems to have something seems to have culturally gone wrong, where we are not encouraging people who can afford to have children and can afford to raise them to do it correctly. But the problem, of course, it's like it is every person's right to procreate, though, of course. So it's really curious again how we tackle that as a country. But who knows? I don't know. As a random aside to the abortion thing, and there are of course other things like sub-markets. There's the trade in fetal tissue and stem cells, organ harvesting. There's some quite dark things that come out of the abortion black market industry. I mean, I couldn't really say too much about it. It's just rumors and things that I've seen online, and you don't really know how to tackle that sort of thing on top of the issues there. Sorry, any thoughts on any of that? I've just been rambling for a couple of minutes there.
No, I've seen a few things about sort of black market abortion harvesting parts of aborted fetuses as well. I would like to hope it's not true, but the world in which we live just now, it's probably quite hard to say. As for the age thing as well, like I was quite a young mum. I had my first son when I was 19 and my second son when I was 21. I am one of the youngest mums in my children's school. Their father's a bit older. Their father is 12 years older than me. So he's on par age-wise with the parents at school. But I think a lot of women possibly feel a bit of pressure nowadays as well. whether to put having a child before a career or having a career before a child. I certainly know women at both sides. Some women just wanted to be mums, and they brought their children up like myself. I didn't particularly set out to be a mum. I fell pregnant. I brought my children up, and then went to university. I was a mechanic before I had children. And then you've got the opposite side of women who want to put their careers first, and that's fine as well. I think every woman and man, they've got the right to decide when they want to have children. I don't think anyone should be judged for what age they decide to have children either. Where I grew up, I had friends that had children 14, 15, which obviously that's not consensual in the eyes of the law. They turned out to be good mums, but they shouldn't have been. But I don't know if there's any benefits for older mums or younger mums. Some people say if you're older, you've got more patience and you're financially better off. But then again, there's a flip side for that argument as well. Like if you're a younger mum, you've maybe got more energy to run about after your children. So I suppose it depends on each individual person. Yeah,
I mean, we're probably, as a generation, we're probably aging better. So when people, you see pictures of people in their 30s from 1920 or whatever, they were finished. They were knackered by that by the time they were the mid 30s. So yeah, I mean, people didn't live as long, so you probably we do probably have more energy into our 30s and 40s than people would have done.
Saying that, I'm 30 now, and I could not imagine going through, bringing up babies again. I think I'm glad I did it when I did, because now I just I don't know. I think maybe it's because I've already got 2 children and I'm past that stage. My brother just had a daughter. She is 3, so not just had a daughter. But I kind of watch him running about after, and I'm like, oh my God, you must be exhausted. Whereas mine are kind of at that fun age where you can sit and have conversations with them, and things are different. Like my youngest one's so inquisitive. He asks random. Actually, he was in school the other day and they were talking about this, totally off topic, but they were talking about the moon landing, and he's seen a photo and there was a footprint on the moon, and he was really, really quizzing his teacher, and he's like, but it's rock, how could there be a footprint on the moon? Do you think the moon landing was faked? Is it maybe photoshopped? And he really thinks outside the box, and I love that because they've got their own ideas at the age mine are now. But then I've loved every stage, but I couldn't see myself going back to the whole changing nappies and being up through the night. So I don't know.
Yeah, it certainly looks exhausting from the outside.
It is.
Yeah, it's remarkable you mentioned the moon landing because I think that my next episode is actually going to be with the original guy who goes after the moon landing as a conspiracy. There's a guy called Bart Sibrel. There's a documentary on YouTube that's got about 5 million viewers. Mm-hmm. He's written a book and whatnot. It's curious that that was probably the first conspiracy theory I got interested in when I was about 8 or 9. Probably.
That's how my youngest is. He's 8. He's just 9 in a month's time. And do you know what? The way his mind works is amazing. He questions everything, and I encourage it. I think he totally should. So I'm going to look that documentary up for him.
Yeah, it's called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. Regarding conspiracies, you probably need to make a decision with him now whether to let that run wild or to cut it off as quickly as possible, because he'll turn up like me, a complete lunatic. So there we go. There we go.
No, I think it's good. I think you shouldn't believe everything you see in the news or the media, and I think you should question. And I've always told the boys that question everything. There's no question is a silly question, and he certainly keeps his teacher on his toes, and his teacher is always telling me how he's a delight to teach and how he never knows what's coming out of his mouth next.
Yeah, fair enough. So to try and marry the 2 issues that I brought you on for, your lawsuit, I believe you're represented by Joanna Cherry of the SNP.
Yes, she is one of the people representing me. I also have another QC representing me as well, I won't name it this time.
Was I allowed to name Joanna Cherry there? That's out there already, isn't it?
Yeah. She's been named in the news, so that's fine.
Okay. Why then did you choose to stand for the Alba Party and not the SNP? Were you previously an SNP supporter who followed Alex Salmond across, or is there something else there?
No, I've always been a sort of, try to think of the right word. I have always followed Alex Salmond. When I was 18, he presented me with an award, Mechanic of the Year. I didn't know anything about politics at that time. I just had to go to Holyrood and get this award. And he came across as a really nice, caring man at that point. And that kind of encouraged me to look into politics. And then obviously we had the independence referendum, and I voted to leave. I followed the SNP. And then when Alex Salmond stood down, I sort of stepped back from the SNP as well. Just, I was never a huge fan of Nicola Sturgeon. I just never have really been a fan of hers. I don't really like the way she conducted herself in public. I just don't think she's the best speaker in the world. Not that I'm a brilliant speaker or anything like that, but I just, I don't think she's great. Whereas I think Alex Salmond really knows how to hold an audience. He's captivating. And yeah, so the reason for Stand for Alba was because it was an independence party, and they care about women's rights, and they care about poverty. And poverty is something really, really close to my heart. I was brought up, poverty is probably putting it nicely, and I am a big believer that, children are victims of circumstance. It's maybe not the right term to use, but no child asks to be born. And if we can try and eradicate poverty, we'll never eradicate poverty. But I think if we try and, we do our best, I think it's achievable to make every child almost equal. So that was another reason I joined the Alba Party as well. But I think probably the main reason was Alex Salmond. If somebody else had started the Alba Party, probably wouldn't have looked twice at it, because we've got other parties here in Scotland that have got similar values, like ISP. It's a good party, but I like Salmond. It was him that kind of got me interested in politics.
Yeah, that's that's fair enough. I mean, my cards on the table. I'm not a supporter of the SNP or Alba. I probably lean towards more libertarian things, which doesn't necessarily put me against independence. I just feel like I would be concerned if it was the SNP that were doing it. If that makes sense.
It's SNP that are putting all these gender acts through. It's SNP who are asking our children appropriate questions at school. I would never support the SNP now. Yeah,
I mean, I previously I was never a fan of Alex Salmond, but I probably have softened on him. Like, I remember him more fondly than my opinion of him at the time as First Minister. I mean, he was at least a serious politician who would engage in debates and not just shut people down disparagingly, which I think you alluded to, what Nicola Sturgeon essentially does. She doesn't speak particularly well. It comes across as perhaps the headmistress type, who talks down to people, tells them what they should be doing, as opposed to trying to engage with them, as it were. I mean, something I find interesting or odd, or perhaps just an observation, but it appears to me that Alex Salmond is accused of sexual harassment of women, but was personally defended by the people who would generally land on the side of women's rights campaigns in your situation, e.g. Joanna Cherry is a big supporter of his. I find it to be quite a curious juxtaposition there. I mean, what's your thoughts on that? Would you say he was treated unfairly in his situation?
I think, he was proven not guilty in a court of law, so I stand by that verdict.
That's short and sweet. Yeah, I mean, fair enough. I mean, there was certainly rumours that it was an SNP stitch up from the Sturgeon side of things. I mean, I don't know how that would ever be proven, but it's something of curiosity, I would say.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't think I can speak about that.
Fair enough. Yeah, so you briefly mentioned this as well, but from the outside, it looks as though the SNP leadership has adopted a radical woke agenda, kind of in line with certain other leaders whom I would deem as globalist. For example, Justin Trudeau of Canada. Sturgeon was in America this week hanging out with Nancy Pelosi, of all people. There certainly seems to be an influence coming from the Green Party over here, whose leader Patrick Harvey. He blamed Alba supporters for a torrent of transphobic abuse, I think was his exact phrase. Do you think there's a divide within the SNP in regards to identity politics, climate policy, etc., etc.? And do you think the SNP has changed in the last decade? Certainly since Alex Salmond's left.
SNP has definitely changed in the last decade. I think, personally, my views are SNP don't really care about independence anymore. Just before the vote, Nicola Sturgeon had come out and, she was alluding to the fact that independence was her priority. And then just after the vote was counted, she said that there wasn't enough support for independence anymore. But by the looks of the vote, SNP got the majority. So if you're voting for SNP, in my opinion, you're voting for independence. So I don't know. I definitely would not class SNP as the party of independence. I would when Alex Salmond was the party leader. I think Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP, hopefully not all of the SNP, in fact I know not all of the SNP, they're caught up in this identity politics. They're now in coalition with the Green Party, who I think accumulated 7% of the vote at the time. So we've now got a government leading us that we didn't vote for, and that's not democracy. I don't know what the SNP's agenda is, but I definitely don't think it's to the benefit of the Scottish people.
Yeah. A friend of mine said to me recently that they no longer believed in voting for the SNP, but they were going to do it anyway, as they believe that strongly in independence. I would argue that things would be immeasurably worse under an independent SNP government, especially taken back into the EU, which strips the country of its independence immediately. So it's kind of pointless.
Yeah, I suppose if you go into the EU, if you vote for independence, you're a sovereign state, and then you're handing your sovereignty over to the EU.
Yeah.
I think EFTA is quite a good move. But going back into the EU, it doesn't make any sense to me, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly mutated as an organisation. Certainly over the last 20 years, it seems to have got more power hungry, is probably the best way of putting it. My position is essentially as little government as possible. They just get in the way, create unnecessary costs, layers of administration and whatnot. All taxation is theft and whatnot. For what it's worth, I actually think the SNP and Westminster Conservatives, I think they both love the current situation. I mean, because they'll both perpetually win elections, blame each other, and never actually have to do anything about it.
I noticed through the campaign, and SNP were just, vote SNP 1 and 2, don't vote the Conservatives because they're doing this. And then the Conservatives are like, oh, vote Conservatives, don't vote SNP. And it's like a rivalry between the two. And I think looking at it the way I do just now, I think they kind of help each other. It's like that sort of if you hate the Conservatives, you're going to vote for SNP, and if you hate the SNP, vote for Conservatives, and everybody else just vote for whoever because it doesn't matter.
Yeah, the numbers are balanced exactly perfectly, that the Conservatives will always win the British election because Labour won't have a look in unless they have the votes from Scotland.
Yeah.
And the SNP will always win in Scotland because the Conservatives can't get a look in Scotland, and neither will Labour. So it's like you say, they're in a symbiotic relationship, essentially. It's quite horrifying.
I'm not really for that, but I don't think they're for this podcast.
That's a shame. You mentioned about the leaflets there, the vote 1 and 2. I noticed on the Alba leaflets, they shied away from explicitly mentioning the SNP. It just said vote 1 and 2 for independence supporting candidates. Given that my perception is that the SNP's mutated over the last decade, do you think potentially propping them up is a price worth paying for an independent Scotland? And what worried me initially when the Alba Party first formed was that it was a way of playing the voting system to make sure independent supporting parties won the election, but because we've got an odd system in this country where it's the disproportionate amount of MSPs to the vote count. I don't think anyone even understands it. I certainly don't understand how the council elections work with the 1, 2, 3, and 4 and whatnot. But I was concerned that it was a way of playing the system and that Salmond would be straight back in with the SNP, but it seems to have gone the complete opposite way. If anything, it's made it more obvious how much of a divide there is between the two philosophies there. So, I mean, like you said, do you think propping them up is a price worth paying for potentially getting independence?
So I don't speak for Alba. Personally, I do not agree with voting SNP at all. I think if you vote for SNP, you're voting for, getting your children groomed and various other fantasies that the SNP have got. I think voting for Alba number 1 and voting for independence parties 2 and 3, I think that was our way of handing out the olive branch and saying we are, like Alba are, prepared to work with other independence parties. But I think what was shown after the election, some of the comments that Nicola Sturgeon made, she's not prepared to work with any other independence parties. I think independence terrifies Nicola Sturgeon. I don't think Nicola Sturgeon wants independence, which is why she wanted you to vote for SNP number 1 and 2, because then she made sure she had the majority, and they can just keep saying, oh, we'll have a referendum next year. Oh, well, this year's not the time. We're going to have one next year. And, things keep cropping up. And she's like, oh, well, we can't have a referendum because of this. So I think, my personal opinion is Alba want independence and will work with anyone on the road to independence. SNP, in my opinion, don't want independence and will not work with any independence party, but seem quite happy to work with Conservatives, Labour and Green.
Yeah, it's curious, isn't it? So the council elections, before I get to that, I just wanted to make a strange point. I mean, Alba obviously then represents the more traditional elements of the independence movement. People who don't seem to want to be bogged down in identity politics. But to be fair to Nicola Sturgeon for a minute, the country was in the midst of a pandemic, economic crisis, but our First Minister managed to pardon the witches from 300 years ago. Yeah. So that was good of her. Any thoughts on that?
I think there was much more she could have done with her time than pardon. I mean, I understand a lot of people appreciated her doing that. I personally didn't. I thought that time could have been better used. But this is Nicola Sturgeon we're talking about.
Yeah, if there's one thing she knows how to do, it's waste time. Yeah, so the council elections came and went. I'd hoped to speak to you in advance, but one thing or another got in the way. The Alba Party in general seemed to struggle to make a breakthrough in much the same way as the 2021 Holyrood elections. I find it mind-boggling that arguably the two best Scottish politicians of the last decade, last few decades, Alex Salmond and George Galloway, regardless of their faults or stances, it's crazy that they're not given more of a platform, as I think it would probably drastically change people's voting habits. How did you find the experience of being a candidate, and what do you think could improve numbers in future?
I just want to touch on something you said. I think there's probably a reason they weren't given a platform, because had they been given the correct platform, they probably would have had a better breakthrough than what we did. The council elections, it was great fun, actually. It was very tiring, especially near the end. And I don't regret a thing, and I would most definitely run again and intend to run again for Alba. It was a great experience. It was. I lost it on first preference by 6 votes to the SNP, which I think is actually a really good achievement. Obviously, I was a bit gutted that I didn't win, and I was very gutted that Alba didn't make any kind of breakthrough candidate-wise. But I think we just need to keep fighting the good fight and just, keep doing more, raising awareness and getting our name out there, because we're a very new party. We've only just been established a year. And you know what? Everybody's got to start small.
Yeah, you say that, but I don't feel like the former First Minister should have to start small. He certainly should have had somewhat of a platform. I remember the last year when you would have Sturgeon and Douglas Ross and Anna Sarwar, and they'd all be, and Patrick Harvey and whoever the hell the Lib Dem person was at the time, they were on the BBC and they're all stood round and they would just be shouting at each other across the room about nothing. And you were just thinking, none of these people know how to actually present arguments or even take the other one down. They But if you had Alex Salmond there and George Galloway, who are capable politicians who've proven themselves over long careers.
Tommy Sheridan as well. He's fantastic.
Yeah, why not? I mean, but that's the point. It's as if I suppose their argument that it's like a circular argument is a problem. Like the BBC or the news outlets will say, "Oh well, they don't get enough of the vote to warrant being in front of the general public, but they don't get enough of the vote because they're not in front of the general public." Like, I wouldn't be surprised if most people don't know where Alex Salmond's gone.
No, I agree with you there. I don't think Alba have had much publicity at all. Like I see on Twitter, everybody knows who they are, but Twitter is not the real world. We got a Political Party broadcast on TV, but in comparison, even I think Alba got more of a mention after the vote than what we even did before the vote, which, you know, was unfair. And I think potentially it'll be the same again. I think you're right. If we had more media attention, more people would be aware of us. And I found when I was out canvassing, a lot of people they didn't know who Alba were, or they were like, "Oh, I'm not voting for you, you're just the SNP." And I'm like, "No, we're not the SNP." And you have to explain, you know, they're a different party. So I think a lot of people got their wires crossed in that sense. Not a lot of people really had a great understanding of Alba. And then obviously you spoke to the people and you said it's Alex Salmond's party, and you obviously get the SNP supporters that are like, "Well, Alex Salmond's this and that." And my usual comeback is, "Well, if he's that, who were you voting for when he was in charge at SNP?" To which point we don't usually give you an answer.
Yeah, you must have enabled him when you were voting for him then. You know? So, yeah, you can usually find the flaws in the logic quite rapidly. So yeah, you said you're gonna stand again.
Yeah, most definitely. It was a great experience, and now that I've done it once, I imagine doing it a second time would be much easier, and I would be more prepared next time. But it was a good experience, and I've made some friends as well who I would actually consider to be lifelong friends through this. So yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic. Gutted that I didn't win, but it just means I've got to try harder next time.
Yeah, are you going to try the Westminster or the Holyrood elections instead of just the council ones?
Oh, absolutely. If the opportunity arises, absolutely.
Great. I mean, I was toying with it as well as either an independent or with the Libertarian Party, but I'm loath to for this probably the same reason you said at the beginning about getting the media attention. You kind of go, oh, well, as soon as you put yourself out there like that. Again, I appreciate the irony that I'm sat here doing a podcast, which I will then upload to the internet. But it's kind of it is the next level of scrutiny, I suppose, isn't it? You know.
Do you know what? The scrutiny doesn't bother me. Really, I don't mind. I didn't really have any sort of skeletons in the closet that I had to hide. And do you know what? People are going to talk about you anyway. So what does it matter?
Where can people find more information about your future plans, or maybe keep up to date on how your lawsuit's going, or some of your women's rights campaign news?
Generally, I use Twitter as an outlet. I've got a fundraising page as well for, obviously, I can't afford to do the university on my own because I'm unemployed. So I have got a website set up. It's lisakeogh.uk. There is information on there about the lawsuit. I don't think it's been updated recently. I'll actually have to get that done. I don't actually run it myself because I am not very good with that sort of thing. As for keeping people updated with the court case, I have put it on Twitter, and I will update it as and when I'm allowed to update it. And I think the Daily Mail are sort of covering it as well, so it will be in the Daily Mail. They have been really, really supportive about it. They supported me right from the very beginning. So yeah, it'll be between Twitter and Daily Mail, I imagine, and obviously lisakeogh.uk.
Excellent. I would urge everyone to look up your story to get a bit more information about it. Best of luck with the lawsuit, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Join us next time for the Political Darkside podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.